case scenario, you could go down to about 2 point something. So the difference is actually very huge. But you know, behind that difference are structural changes which are enormous. And those structural changes, for example, involve that whereas in the share of transport accounted for either by railways versus roads, or private transport versus public transport, the past graph is like this, and it's just got to go up. I mean, if it doesn't go up, this ain't going to happen. So really the idea is to force people in the sectors to think, because most people in a sector get used to projecting linearly. So they say, this is what's been happening, this is what's going to happen. The name of the game is that if it's going to be radically different, you really need to think radically differently. I'll just give you one example because I don't want to go on and on. And anyway, it's on the website, and my whole objective here is to titillate rather than to educate, so that you can actually go and look at it yourself. One of the most interesting things that comes out is that, you know, on a business as usual basis, you would have a tremendous increase. Obviously in energy, most of our energy comes from coal. Electricity depends on coal, so therefore we need a whole lot of capacity based on coal burning. On the other hand, and that's what's going to give you 5.7 tons per capita. I mean, the global carbon budget for 2050 is 20. The Americans are around 18, the Europeans are around 10, we're at 1.7, the Chinese are over 4. So the whole assumption is that by 2050, the world average should be 2. According to business as usual, we would be at 5.6. This would be perfectly okay if everybody else goes down to 1, but that's not likely. So there's a problem. But you know, the growth in capacity of coal burning thermal generating capacity is extremely impressive. So if you were manufacturing generating capacity, and you had your little analysts and all the guys who were looking at your demand and so on, they would say, yeah, there's a huge demand in India, this has got to expand, we've got to do this, we've got to do the other. But if on the other hand you take seriously the objective of a significant reduction, it's simply not going to happen if the generating capacity for electricity is necessary, but it'll have to be from renewables. So we asked ourselves the question, what does this imply for the total generating capacity that would exist on coal burning electricity? The answer is it would decline slightly. Now, which would really mean that allowing for depreciation, you always need some more additions, but whoever is thinking of investing long term in people making generating sets burning coal should either assume that we're going to be on this path, or else we better think again. One last example, just to tell you how difficult these things are. Globally, and I think it was Nick Stern who actually said that in Davos. Globally, he said that, or no, maybe it was Jeff Sachs, one of them, one of the two. And what he said was that, look, if the world is actually going to achieve the objective of bringing emissions down to the extent that is generally thought to be appropriate, then something like 30 to 40% of the known reserves of fossil fuels should never be used. Forget about the additions. And right now, some of the best people in the world are running around discovering more fossil fuels. So are we. I mean, obviously, everyone wants as much as they can for themselves. But you know, the economics of that is quite extraordinary, because what it really means is that the present book value of all the guys who own energy resources had better be reduced by about 40% if half of the stuff, almost, is never going to be used because we're so successful in this other area. So these are not small changes. The changes are big. But as the minister said, one thing is very clear, it's going to be driven by technology. I mean, everything is being driven by technology. The Malthusian horror didn't come because of technology. And I think Sheikh Zaki Yamani once said that the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. And I mean, that's I think, a very powerful point. So we're not going to run out of oil, we're not going to run out of coal, but are we going to have the ability not to use them? Now, globally, and I'm not talking about India, and I was really saddened to hear that Australia has just repealed a carbon tax. As the most important policy initiative in the world of energy taken by, and actually I shouldn't be saying this, but they are, after all, the G20 presidency. I mean, they repealed the carbon tax. It's tough. And the implication for India also is that, you know, as a general rule, if you want to see a structural change in quantities, I mean, economists know that it has to be accompanied by a change in prices. It's very difficult to believe that you're going to see such a big change in quantities if you don't see a corresponding change in prices. Now, technology will do some of that, wind, solar, etc. But I think from the Indian point of view, the biggest issue really is, are we going to be able to reflect not just the economic costs, but actually the social costs in fossil fuel prices. At the moment, we're not even reflecting the economic cost. In fact, we're subsidizing them. And that's not just us, that's the whole world. So I think the bottom line is that research institutions, the press, everybody has to be very, very clear that while everybody votes for determined and firm action on climate change, I do not see a comparable dedication to create a commitment to do what is necessary to facilitate the action on climate change, either globally or domestically. I think the Secretary General of the OECD, in a rather nice lecture on climate change, sort of mentioned some report, UN report, which says that the totality of what has been done globally now is going to take us between 1/4 and 1/2 the distance needed to reach the targets that we have. So the agenda is very, very big. But I think the good news is that we've started, and we do need to have a huge build-up of public opinion, not just supporting the objective, but actually supporting the components of what that objective means. Thank you.
Thank you, Montek. Montek has just outlined how difficult our task is in the coming few weeks of, you know, taking that model and embedding it with the costs. But we will do it. We at ICRIER, we promise that we will do it and try to encourage more informed debate on this. May I now request Anil Padmanabhan to kind of moderate the panel discussion, starting with Mrs. Kidwai. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajat. And once again, I'd like to welcome the entire panel. And thank you both for setting the context so beautifully on the no-brainer fact that you do need both actions on preventing climate change. So because we're short on time, the way I thought we'd structure it is I'll run quickly through the panel, and then I see a lot of experts in the audience who can, I'm sure, dwell with greater erudition than me in directing questions at them. So if I could begin with Naina, you know, they have set the context, the urgency for the change. Now the onus is on business, on basically private sector. How do you do it? You know, what is the business model? Because, like they said, there are costs associated with it. So how do you, on the private side, look at this challenge, and how do you think we can address it?
Well, that's a big question, Anil, but let me try and just cover off some of the areas. Clearly, we have seen some interesting developments over the last decade in terms of mitigation initiatives, and I think one of the most significant ones there was bringing in a market mechanism, the CDM. And we found in India itself, 1,600 companies had become involved, over 2,500 projects, which tells me that there was indeed an embracing of a mechanism such as that. And I think from an industry perspective, to Montek's point, that's important to see the support for the components that help us get there is going to be critical. And therefore, where are we in terms of a market-based mechanism? And if it isn't a reinforcement of the old, then a new mechanism needs to be devised to provide that boost to industry in terms of emission reductions. Now, I think business leaders today believe that low carbon development is an opportunity. And I think that's really the base. It's not an obligation, and that any form of growth is compatible with decarbonization. So I think there's an alignment there. And essentially, businesses have fostered strategies for low carbon development, not by frankly prioritizing environment and sustainability, which I do believe are very important, but recognizing the opportunities of low carbon growth. So as long as we get to the same objective, irrespective of what that motive is, I think it becomes important to align there. Now, we've seen the private sector get involved in several mitigation initiatives outside of the CDM as well. Initiatives with state governments on climate smart initiatives for cities, projects, the various national action plans on climate change, the national solar mission, enhanced energy efficiency. But essentially, I think it comes back to what does business needs. So really the market mechanism, as I highlighted already, financing, and Anil, we were just talking about that. Financing is a huge issue right now in the renewable space, and it's something that we cannot wish away. In fact, it isn't just an issue in India. I'm part of an inquiry at UNEP, the United Nations level, which is a global inquiry set up for an 18-month sort of objective on what needs to be done for financing in this space, because it is a challenge. And the challenge in India is that the renewables players are finding it very hard to get the financing. Financing specifically around projects which have specifically, of course, renewables, but also energy efficiency as a motive. Don't get financed just for that. You get financed because you are a company or because of the entire project. But there's no benefit in terms of being an energy efficient component of a financing. And I think that without financing, we are not going to see this development. In fact, it was identified again at the BRICS Business Council meetings. You'll be happy to know that both the agenda for the BRICS Business Council and there were 4 big agendas out there. The green economy was one. And the BRICS Bank, which has been announced, has clearly embraced the green economy as one of its objectives as well. So there are new bodies coming up. It is not going to be for lack of focus in the space, but clearly a lot more has to be done in the financing agenda. And I think, so it's market mechanism, financing agenda, and the third I would like to put out is technology and the financing of new technologies, which again is a big issue. That is not just debt and bank financing, that is also venture capital, financing of equity, and indeed creating the right environment for transfers of technology, where the high cost of IPRs in the advanced technology space is a major barrier to adopt and adapt as we go forward, particularly when we look at distributed models that India needs, distributed solar down at the village level, and adopting and adapting technologies which are available, but getting them to India and down at that level at the right price is a challenge. So it's the entire gamut, really, of financing that covers all these spaces and also the availability, which become key. So let me just end there, Anil. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to turn to the 2 politicians on the panel, and just this, you both addressed it passing in both your presentations, but Dr. Ahluwalia, your example about Australia dropping the carbon tax. So, this temptation for dirty growth, how do politicians, because you're vulnerable, elected office, you have to address these issues. So how do you fight this? You see in Australia has succumbed to it. So how do you fight the temptation for not going for dirty growth, which is faster, cheaper, and will probably get you more votes? So if I could begin with you.
Well, I think there's 2 ways. First of all, you have to make the argument in the way that I and Montek were making it just now, that you can have jobs you can grow and go green at the same time. I think, though, the reality is that in the UK, we've certainly had a big political debate about energy bills. People worried about high energy costs. The reality of it is that green policies have not been responsible for that. It's been wider trends in global gas markets, actually. But nevertheless, it's created an environment where energy costs are a political issue, and anyone who's talking about a policies which might increase energy costs, people think that's quite an odd thing to do if you want to get elected. So there are various things that we do to deal with that, and I'll keep it brief. First of all, competition. We try to make sure the energy companies are having to compete and keep their costs as low as possible. And we've really done quite a lot of work on competition in our electricity and gas markets. Secondly, energy efficiency. Energy efficiency in many ways is this political gift for us to use in this context. Because if you can drive a wedge between the price of energy and the bills people pay, because you're helping them use less energy, then you can go green and it can be seen to be affordable. So we're spending a lot of time on energy efficiency in reducing the ways that products use electricity, in insulating people's homes and so on. And the third thing is actually helping the poor. Absolutely critical. We've developed a lot of policies to ensure that the poorest in our society get extra support with their energy bills. And you could even say in industry, we're trying to help the energy intensives as well, because we don't want to see those companies close down and move to other countries, what we call carbon leakage. We want to make sure we keep those companies. So helping energy intensives is also part of the political solution to managing this change.
No, I think you touched on a very important point, and you know, there's no simple way of. I'm not a politician, so I can't answer how do you handle the politics. But I think, as the minister pointed out, this is globally a problem, and it is very difficult. But you know, before politicians can actually address this issue, thought leaders ought to at least put it on the agenda. I mean, you don't expect a politician to come out there and say, "Oh, by the way, I've been thinking, and I think we should raise the price of energy." I mean, the least you expect him to say is that all industry organizations believe that we will not transit to the kind of long-term competitiveness that we need if we don't have a realistic price of energy. All think tanks believe it, etc., and hopefully many of the political parties, and then they can say, well, you know, I know it's tough, etc., but let's do something sensible. So quite honestly, at least for this audience, we shouldn't be worrying about the politicians. I mean, in a democratic environment, politicians respond to the environment created. They don't have to get complete consensus, but I think that the thinking side, talking about India, not even begun to address this issue. And let me give you complex problems that come up. I mean, for example, we had a very nice energy design on solar, where we said, look, you've got to have renewable energy. So every distribution company is forced to buy 5% of its energy from renewable sources. Now that's implicitly, the renewable sources are more expensive. I mean, hopefully they'll ultimately become less so, but they are at the moment. So you put that into your costs and you charge everybody a little bit higher and you notch it up as a gain for society. But what happens is that, you know, this was meant to be done against tradable renewable energy certificates. So immediately states find that if your distribution company is forced, you don't have the capacity to generate renewable energy yourself, the economically sensible thing is to buy a renewable energy certificate from wherever in the country renewable energy is produced cheapest. But then state governments tend to feel that their consumers are subsidizing somebody else's producers. And it's not been easy to implement. But most economists would say, oh, that's really bright. I mean, that's a very good idea. So we have to, and the same thing is true, for example, on the underpricing of diesel. It's well established that pollution content of diesel, particularly in congested urban environments, much worse than petrol. And yet, I mean, we are now correcting it. For the last 2 years, the present government has also continued that, correcting for the price of diesel. But actually, given the pollution involved, diesel cars should be overtaxed. But there's simply no willingness to do that. So I think, and this is not raised at a few actually even the environmentalists do not look for price solutions. So what the environmentalists love the idea that we should ban the production of diesel cars, but they're not actually in favor of raising diesel prices. So I think that as a research institutions, you guys have a lot of work to do educating the opinion makers in this country to produce pressure. I think it's happening a little bit, by the way. But right now, I mean, you know, take the adjustment on gas prices. It's become controversial. Supreme Court says, I think we've appointed another committee to go into it. But the factual position, after all, is that the previous formula gave producers $4 per whatever the million, that alphabet soup of units, MMBTU, $4. The Rangarajan formula, and we're importing it at $14, and the Rangarajan formula said $8. But 2 parliamentary committees said this is scandalous. So, I mean, you know, we have a long way to go in making this part of a publicly understood issue. What is a sensible energy pricing system? And incidentally, I'm totally in favor of absolutely protecting the poor. I mean, electricity, etc., the first 100 units or first so many 100 units can be subsidized, providing it's recouped from the others. And please don't recoup it from the fiscal, from the government. Cross-subsidize, I mean, if you're really interested in doing that. So the argument that we must keep these things low because of the poor is totally false in my view. But I don't think that what I'm saying is, I don't find politicians, we haven't put politicians in a position where they would feel pressure against these kinds of arguments. I mean, they would be able to say, no, there's nobody in favor of it. And I think that needs to change.
Thank you. You just proved you are not a politician, what you just said. Naina, you want to jump?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to jump in really on the fact that I think there is this issue around communication, because you talk climate change and it's really the same faces talking about the same thing and beating our heads on, hey, well, why isn't the rest of the world getting it? But you then begin to look at what that communication messaging can be around, and I think you begin to understand at least some politicians get it, as indeed we have heard the Right Honourable Davey and Montek, who professes not to be a politician but clearly is very articulate on these issues. And but you know, you mentioned pollution. Now, the minute you begin to showcase where China is and people going around their main cities with masks, it's very telling. And the fact that India is absolutely on that path, where this is the stuff that we are going to be breathing and there's no running away from it. It's a whole different messaging. But we never start at that level. You did. And I think that is really where our starting point has to be. It's not about emissions, because who relates to that? It's about what the air you're going to be breathing and the effect of that if you don't do what you have to today. So it is about really communicating where we believe we have to go, but doing it in a way which actually draws tears today from people who have to care, who may not care about emissions, but care about the air they breathe. And I think that brings me to another space which becomes very key, is the urban environment for India. With the urbanization we are seeing, and clearly there's a focus around smart cities and new cities, is the whole planning around urbanization and transport therein, and what that new urban environment should look like, as we do indeed find we lug people from, you know, residential areas down to business areas, as against having much more of a mixed development as we go forward. I don't know if we have quite arrived at what that new urban environment in India should look like. And I know there's fabulous work being done. I know that we have experts amongst us like ICRIER today. And if we can raise that discussion, because we tend to look at it otherwise in silos, transportation as separate from housing, as separate from affordable housing. And rather than look at this whole thing together, it's really where we need to head in terms of the planning that we put in. And then if you begin to micro-manage that planning into what that building should look like and exactly what those emission standards should be, I think we might get at least one aspect of India's growth under some control.
I'll just open it up to the audience. We have very little time, so about 2 or 3 quick questions. Whoever, you can introduce yourself and direct the question at anyone in particular. I don't see hands. Nobody. Oh, okay. The gentleman right at the back.
So I am Kumar Vijay from University of Delhi. It is related to economics and politics. We keep on looking into that, to what extent political willingness is going to be nurtured on cost of economics. Why not there should be a middle path which can be making in that way, where even political willingness is supported through economic exercises and economic framework. And that has to be communicated properly. So agenda has to be prepared in such a way, instead of interfering, it should be symbiotic in nature. If that can be done, I think we can achieve these things.
Thank you. I think that's what both speakers addressed. Anybody else?
I'm K.K. Pandey from Indian Institute of Public Administration. I would like to add to Mrs. Naina Kidwai's intervention on urbanization. We had this Bureau of Energy Efficiency, and they have brought ECBC, Energy Conservation Building Code. But very little progress has been achieved on the implementation of ECBC. And in fact, ECBC itself needs to be modified in view of what we discussed today.
Okay,
and so that housing, transport, etc. can be